Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I am Leah Prime, broadcasting live. Thank you so much for joining the Invisible Night School on this Wednesday evening, right before Thanksgiving. Whether you're with us live or catching us on a replay, we are so glad that you're here. The Invisible Night School is a small consortium of researchers exploring a wide variety of numinous and arcane subjects. You can find us at theinvisiblenightschool.com, and go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and please join our Discord. There's a link included in the video description. So tonight, our very own Luis Cayetano will be leading a discussion on the evolution of complex life. I will get him added to the stream, and I'll also be welcoming, of course, one of our lovely co-hosts, Campbell. This week, Nick is on family duty, I guess, out doing things that normal social people do, like spending time with his kid and going out to dinner, which leaves the rest of us here to fill in the gaps and hopefully have a fruitful discussion. Super excited to see you here tonight, Sways, Spooky, Simon. This is like a who's who. Swank. It's great to see some of our regulars show up week after week. It's really exciting to see a little bit of an audience start forming and building up a community associated with the show. So super excited to see everyone here tonight.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to this convo, especially after last week with Rather. I think it spiraled into this perfectly. Louise, your information that you were bringing to the table was so cool. I kept on wanting to hear more and more, so this was excellent.
Yeah, the general viewer response to Lewis's comments last week were overwhelmingly positive, and I think behind the scenes we've had conversations about opportunities to broaden the subjects we approach on the show, both to draw on our individual interests more, and also to avoid pigeonholing ourselves as a UFO podcast. When I started this, I remember thinking to myself that I wanted to make a UFO podcast for people who hate UFOs. And I feel like the more we kind of broaden out and touch other interesting and numinous and complex subjects, the more we're going to also cultivate a broader audience and fan base that we can work with and learn from and grow with. So I'm super excited about it.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of these subjects are interrelated in unexpected ways. I certainly didn't realize how many different connections there are under the surface of a variety of these things. Like when I started looking at UFOs, I ended up in, magnetohydrodynamics physics papers. And then on the other side of it, consciousness studies and near-death experiences and things. Who would know that those things can even conceptually go together until you dive into it?
Right.
Yeah. Good segue.
So how things? Oh, I was gonna ask how things are in your worlds. Campbell, Lewis, how are you guys doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. UFO stuff. Everybody's been kind of on a holding pattern until this big report comes out, right? So I've been waiting to see what people say, seeing how the community is reacting to the delay. It's kind of a quiet time now, though, I think. And we're seeing that in the community, some little rumblings here and there. Luis, what have you been up to?
I've just been finishing some books that I've been reading, including one by Jason Colavito. I put up a review of that on my channel. It's this book here. It talks about Lovecraft's, impact on ancient astronaut and other, alternative archaeology tropes. Even though he was a complete atheist, I think he would have been actually horrified to see how much his ideas have been kind of used to promote pseudoscience or, inspired pseudoscience.
It seems like a very timely read, too, because Graham Hancock just put out a new series on Netflix, I believe.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The Ancient Apocalypse series. Yeah, that talks about Atlantis and other sort of antediluvian civilizations. So Colavito mentions that it's interesting how you often get like a switch in between which theory is more popular, ancient astronauts at times, and then it switches to the Atlantis style myths.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of goes into the social reasons why that might be in the book as well.
Yeah, Colavito's been a part of the game for a long time. You said the publication date was 2005?
Yeah, that was his first book.
Right.
He was running a chat or like a forum online in the early 2000s about ancient mysteries, and he was kind of initially, when he was like a teenager, he believed a lot of that stuff, but then he became more skeptical when he saw the logical contradictions and things like that, and then he set up that web forum and then kind of compiled that together into the book.
Mm-hmm.
I've encountered Jason Colavito's work numerous times in my research on the UFO subject in general from an academic perspective. He has done a significant amount of work on the history of the national security state in relation to UFOs and the use of ancient astronaut theory by foreign actors, specifically former Soviet Union, to try to destabilize the domestic United States population with propaganda strategies related to, interestingly, racist themes that Colavito touches on frequently in these historical works, where exactly, and you sort of say it since the ancient culture doesn't seem to have been capable of doing this from our perspective, it must have been some kind of super civilization,
The Soviets were actually notorious for trying to stir up racial strife in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Probably wasn't super hard, right? Shooting fish in a barrel.
Exactly. There were already a lot of fractures in the society that they could exploit. But yeah, ancient astronauts, at least for a time, was one of those things that they used. And some of those myths that the Soviets snuck in actually made their way into von Daniken's books. Even though von Daniken is like a conservative anti-communist type, it's kind of ironic that the communist regime intelligence service propaganda was, making its way into his propaganda.
And he wrote is it Chariot of the Gods, is that right?
Chariot of the Gods.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the basic premise of that? I don't recall.
Well, he was actually deeply influenced by Morning of the Magicians, and he was actually sued by Paul and Bergier to actually cite them in future editions of the book. But he was basically, I think it was just a scam for him, because he was a Swiss hotelier and he was embezzling money to like travel around the world. But then he made the excuse that he was like doing research. So
this is like a Adamski story. That's what it reminds me of.
Yeah, exactly. Probably was inspired by Adamski and some of the contactees to an extent. But I mean, his premise was that aliens had visited the Earth in antiquity and influenced human cultural development, gave us the tools for building the pyramids, etc., and maybe even engineered humanity.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's these swaths of ancient alien/alternative history books that were coming out in the 60s and 70s that I think very much laid the foundation for many of the talking points we see today. I think of Worlds in Collision by Velikovsky.
Yes.
I think that's his last name.
Yep.
Zachariah Sitchin, von Daniken, Adamski, and of course then we see these talking points and views being eternally recycled again and again.
Yeah, and by Hancock. He was influenced by a book by, I think, different books, but Ignatius Donnelly's book about Atlantis and Lemuria. Donnelly was I think he was a Indiana or Illinois congressman in the 19th century, sort of around the time of Blavatsky. I think he actually influenced Blavatsky as well, because she also talked about like ancient civilizations and lost knowledge.
Right. But, yeah. The not only the ascended masters, but like the 7 root races and things like that. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
and Lemuria. And
Lemuria.
which is a big one, actually. You see Lemuria being mentioned again and again in the 20th century by various alternative archaeology proponents. But Hancock is like probably the most famous of the Atlantean proponents. He actually did dabble a little bit in ancient astronauts in the 1990s. Like, you know what, Hoagland, the guy with the Martian face?
Oh, Richard C. Hoagland, Face on
Yeah.
Mars, science advisor to Walter Cronkite. That was
Yep.
always what he claimed. I don't even know if the guy has a high school diploma, but
No, Hoagland is just full of crap. But he actually influenced Hancock for a while, and Hancock was open to the idea that there may have been ancient Martian civilizations. But then he sort of let that go and then reverted back to the traditional pure human Atlantis myths.
My only encounter with Graham Hancock, besides just the 1990s consumption of Art Bell, like on a perpetual basis, was I read his book Supernatural a few years ago, which is about basically like mushroom cults and fairies and the sort of perennialist associations of hallucinogens and psychedelics and how they kind of tie into these numinous experiences. I say this without having an exhaustive familiarity with his canon, but I thought it was an interesting book, but it also feels like it may be the one that is perhaps the most academically defensible compared to a lot of what other things he's been involved in. Yes, I appreciate Brooke calling this out here. Hoagland had an Art Bell pipeline. He really did. Showed up on the show constantly. Kind of some of the best episodes were when Richard Hoagland would be stuck across the debate table with someone that had actual science credentials, and you had to listen to two people talk and debate. I think there's an argument or a debate show where he talked to like even Seth Shostak at SETI, which is like bringing a knife to a gunfight. But at any rate. So I just, but before we jump into the complex life discussion, which Lewis will be leading tonight. So I'm just back from like a 4-day silent meditation retreat at a Buddhist center, which was my first foray into this world and this experience. Really fascinating, extremely austere, like 10 hours of silent meditation a day from when I arrived on campus on Thursday through when I departed Monday afternoon. I didn't say a word except for about a 5-minute conversation with the retreat instructor where I talked about the jhanas and Robert Burbea and access concentration associated with meditation. And it's interesting. I've been asked a lot about my experience and takeaways from it, and I feel like they're still settling and processing. But I would assess the time there as overwhelmingly good, complicated in the sense that it is arduous and difficult to sit like that in intense meditation in a silent environment, and kind of not just spend time like that internally, but also the associated, I would say, ego unwinding that happens when you're in that kind of state. But like many other things in my life, it falls squarely into type 2 fun, where when I got in my car Monday afternoon, I was like, I'm never fucking doing that again. Like, this is awful. I'm never doing it. I can't wait to get home. And then like last night, like 36 hours later, I was like, man, I really hope I get the chance to do this again soon. This was really cool. And I can still feel some of the reverberations internally. Like my mind is much quieter. It certainly helps me feel much more confident in these sustained states of internal attention. I wasn't sure how I'd do sort of without the normal distractions and socialization. But it also made very clear to me that working up to more sustained retreat practices like 10 days or 2 weeks or even a month is much further down the road than I expected. But it was a very cool experience overall.
How was it guided? I was wondering about that. Do you have to do sort of prep stuff in advance? Is it silent the entire time? Is somebody sort of talking, instructing as everyone is silent? How does that work?
That's a great question. So the typically these retreats will have some kind of guiding subject, and the nature of this retreat was the Brahma Viharas, which are these four kind of um, cultivated states in Buddhism. There's compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And so we would have our own silent meditation without any sort of instructor involvement for about 10 hours a day, broken up with sitting and walking. And there was no verbal communication at all. We had a bell that would get rung at 30-minute increments, so you could time and decide if you're going to stay on your pillow versus go for a walk. But then, in addition to the meditation sessions, there would be, 4 hours a day of Dharma talks, which for the uninitiated, a Dharma talk is, I think, what a Christian would call like a homily. Like there would be a selection of readings from the Pali Canon. Well, this particular retreat was not of a lineage. It was based on a lot of work of monastics in the Theravadan tradition, which is a kind of very orthodox in the sense it's very adherent to the original canon, the Pali Canon. And during the Dharma talks, we would the instructor would speak to us. Typically, we'd open with 15-minute silent practice, then 30 to 45 minutes of discussion of particular excerpts from the Pali Canon about, loving kindness or compassion or equanimity or sympathetic joy, and then the last part of the Dharma talk would typically be some kind of guided meditation. So the instructor would sit in the front of the room. We would be all on our pillows or on our chairs, and she would, in perfect meditation guiding voice, tell us what we should think about, what we should cultivate, where we would feel it in our soma, like as a embodied experience. So that was really the only instruction provided. For our silent retreat time, we could practice any kind of meditation we wanted. So mindfulness, insight, jhanas, metta. I mostly focused on metta and trying to get into some of the jhanas, the first or second jhana, which is considered like an altered state. It's like a ecstatic kind of feeling. But I will say too, attending, so I have the great fortune of having a lot of time right now in my life. So I do have the personal time to invest in meditation, but from a group dynamic perspective, I did find it very helpful to be in a group environment. There's just a kind of different energy to the experience. But I also found, while excruciating, like my hip flexors are still angry at me for sitting on that little pillow for 30 hours or however many hours I did. It feels like this accelerated my practice in a substantial way in such a short period of time, where it's much easier to access those states now when I sit down to meditate. So it kind of, in a sense, was a jump start. And you'll hear people report this, sort of the conventional or standard hardcore introduction to meditation a lot of Westerners have is through a Goenka or Vipassana retreat, which are these free 10-day retreats that are extremely austere, same deal, like 8 to 10 hours a day of meditation. And they basically will kickstart your practice in a way that in theory will be sustainable after the retreat. But it's, in terms of, I'm sorry, I'm like totally going off on my like current special interest, which is obviously meditation and Buddhism. But I work with a pragmatic Dharma teacher right now. So this is basically Buddhism without the supernatural elements. It's just like almost like having a coach. But am taking like a sweeping tour through a lot of the different lineages before deciding if I even want to affiliate with one or associate with one. I'm especially drawn to ecstatic and mystical branches. So I'm super interested in like Tantra and Vajrayana, which is like more of the Tibetan tradition, which has a lot of these like deities and art and kind of these more arcane and occult in the sense of like hidden practices that can only be introduced to you by a particular teacher. Um, but until I think I've had a more holistic survey of these different schools and lineages, like I'm just in the pragmatic school of just practicing and getting used to meditation and kind of learning the nuts and bolts of the systems. Um,
What is
and I, oh,
Kundalini
go
yoga
ahead.
to it?
So it's another good question. So Kundalini yoga as a thing is actually almost a proprietary kind of yoga that was developed for practitioners. It involves some breath work and some like dynamic movements instead of like holds or poses. But Kundalini yoga is a categorically distinct thing from Kundalini or like a Kundalini awakening. People do experience Kundalini awakenings after practicing Kundalini yoga, but Kundalini yoga is almost like it's almost like a brand name for this one particular style of yoga that was developed. Whereas Kundalini itself is this idea um, of almost like chi or like trapped energy, and then these awakening experiences which typically fall under the umbrella of like a spiritual emergence manifest in things like I would say like ecstatic states of bliss or transcendence, like classical mystical experiences, uh, a sense of cognitive enhancement, a sense of increased energy. People report it's intensely physical. Um, and like people report everything from like um, feeling like they are not in control of their bodies and assuming kriyas or particular positions, all the way through like people reporting spontaneous orgasm and stuff like that. So like Kundalini awakenings just become this kind of like waste paper basket of experiences that people who happen to do yoga or meditation associate with the term Kundalini.
It's interesting that there are so many different effects that people report from the different practices. And it reminds me of something that somebody I knew before they went to university was telling me about. And then they went to university for chiropractic.
Mm-hmm.
And they were into sports a lot, so they knew the functional benefits. And when they were going into the chiropractic, I was telling them, oh, you have to be mindful. There is that underlying philosophy that's sort of a little bit not based on the scientific method.
Anything,
And
yeah.
they were like, what do you like? They had no idea what I was talking about, a little bit offended because they'd used it so much. And it was this classic thing that we've talked about so many times, that you can observe an effect, but to attribute that effect to a particular cause is not necessarily true, right? So chiropractic,
Right.
it's like the actual philosophy says that there's something called like inherent intelligence flowing through our
Mm-hmm.
bodies, and that the channels of the inherent intelligence can be misaligned and stuff like that. That's not based in anything scientific, but through practicing the actual whatever process, the modality of chiropractic medicine, you produce these functional benefits that are very well established.
Right.
It makes
I
me wonder if this is similar.
in another life when I was like basically a semi-pro strength athlete, like regularly lifting and competing, there's of course everyone who I would train with would also have a chiropractor, and I have never been to one. But my sense is that a very good chiropractor is effectively just a physical therapist, in the sense that they're going to be doing very similar practices that a physical therapist would do. But particularly in America, I don't know what this is like in Canada, but here, if you go to chiropractor school, I think you can call yourself a doctor, which is obviously confers a degree of legitimacy onto this, what is effectively a pseudoscientific healing modality, where alternative healing modality, whatever. I don't like, I know, I understand that it works for people, so I'm definitely not denigrating that. Um, but also insurance, our
Mhm.
private health insurance, most insurance policies will cover chiropractic treatment.
Yeah.
Um, which between those two things, I think creates a legitimacy that at the root of this discipline or practice I candidly don't think exists. But like the original like orthodoxy of chiropractic work is basically like you can crack your back and cure your allergies and stuff. And
Yes.
it's I think the way it's conventionally practiced now is a far cry from that, but it still is not scientifically grounded in any meaningful sense.
I think that was a great point you just made about insurance and licensing. I actually
Mhm.
worked in Ontario provincially. I worked at a healthcare licensing provincial regulator, and it is exactly what you're talking about. There are issues where, for example, health insurance will be provided through forced registration to certain healthcare practitioners. So if you practice, anything involving manipulation of the soft tissue, yada, 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 then you have to register
Mhm.
as a massage therapist. But then you also have someone who's practicing something like Reiki doing those activities and they register as a massage therapist. So the purpose of getting people to be licensed is not to give them, a sense of their thing they're doing being true. It is to protect the public from potential harm. So licensing is actually the reverse of how people usually think about it. People are forced to be licensed in order to be insured to protect other people against possible harm they might cause. It has nothing to do with like
Mhm.
the legitimacy of the underlying act.
Right.
So that's sort of the sense I was trying to get at there. Anyway, I'd love to pivot and maybe dive into our primary subject if everyone
Yes.
else is okay with that. I'm really excited for it.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
let's do it. So
Let me
Lewis,
share my
let's
folder.
oh
Let me try
yes,
that.
share your folder. And I was just gonna say that this is, you just finished that book by Nick Lane. Actually,
Yeah,
you read both of his books, didn't you?
two of
Um,
his latest books. He's got other books I haven't gone into yet, but I can talk a little bit about um, those ones, and
sure.
some other things. Let me just see. Screen.
Also, and big shout out to my parents who I think are tuning in for the first time tonight. So I'll keep the psychedelic chat to a minimum and just talk about the wholesome subject of evolutionary biology.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we'll be able to figure out a way to shoehorn it in here somehow. I
Is
think
that
every week we've managed.
is that sharing now?
No, so I'm gonna get you added to this, or I'm gonna get it added to the stream. But what do you want to open up? What you're gonna share first?
Oh yeah, there we go. You see that?
Beautiful. Yeah, let me get this added here.
So I did initially have slides that I wanted to show, but I think the subject is just so broad and complex that well, mirroring the actual subject itself, that I just didn't find it very economical. I'll just have some notes next to me that I'll read, and then just show some pictures to kind of guide the discussion, and you guys can just jump in.
Please.
If you see any comments, by the way, guys, you can just tell me that the viewers are making.
Sure.
So this is going to be about complexity of evolution in biological, in the biosphere. So complex organisms, and some of the implications for extraterrestrials. I'll also talk a little bit about human intelligence and cognition, and maybe also a bit about the Fermi paradox.
Great.
So life, it's possibly widespread in the universe, and you often hear the claim that the universe is so big that there has to be life out there, although that's not necessarily true. But let's say that there is life out there and it's common. It does not mean that it's complex life in the sense of multicellular life. It's got varied tissues and organ systems, or complex nervous systems and things like that.
Hmm.
It could be the case that most life in the universe is simply something like prokaryotic life on Earth.
Right.
So that is like bacteria and archaea. Those are unicellular organisms that live on Earth. They're the oldest types of life. And we are eukaryotes. So animals, plants, protists, fungi are eukaryotes. Okay. So eukaryotes have got complex let me just show you this picture.
Sure.
I just we should put the links to the images, by the way, but I got these mostly from Wikipedia, and I apologize for the dark background here because it's a
It's a
PDF.
transparent image, right?
Yeah, but I'll just read you what is shown in here. So this is the interior of a eukaryotic cell, as we would find in our own bodies, although we've got prokaryotes as well, which help us do things like digest certain things, which we can't do by ourselves. So gut bacteria are still very important. But eukaryotic cells have got these complex internal organelles, which are enclosed by membranes. So you see here the nucleus. That's got most of the DNA in the cell, which is locked in here in the form of linear DNA, so linear chromosomes, whereas bacteria have got circular chromosomes, okay? So this nucleus has got pores through which messenger RNA passes out into the cytoplasm. And the messenger RNA is basically a transcribed copy of the DNA, and it's going to be used to translate. It's going to be translated into protein. So proteins are macromolecules which we use for thousands of different things in our bodies. And then you've got these other organelles like the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, lysosomes, various vesicles. And so these are like for processing proteins further or packaging material, sending them to different parts of the cell, or breaking apart certain molecules or toxins and stuff like that. The lysosome.
So they possess, it sounds like, basically a metabolic function, or they perform metabolic
they're
functions.
extremely important for a whole range of metabolic functions. Metabolism is just a whole range of chemical reactions taking place in our bodies. And the important thing here is that these organelles are not present in bacteria or archaea. They are very structurally simple compared to us, although, of course, they're very complex in their own right. But compared to us, they're very simple. Now,
Luis, you were, did you say that bacteria, the chromosomes are actually circular, whereas like ours are linear, like the helical structure, right?
So
or is that something distinct?
Well, it's helical in the sense that it's got the twisty ladder of DNA. But
yes,
it's just by linear, I just mean it's got an end and a start, and if you can in principle just stretch it out into a long string.
Now, why would it be circular in bacteria? I've never heard of that. That's really intriguing.
It could just be something that got frozen in evolution. I'm not actually sure why they do it differently to us.
Strange. Okay.
Yeah, they do actually engage in something called horizontal gene transfer very regularly.
It's euphemistic.
They basically copy out like little pieces of their DNA and swap with each other, and they can use that to acquire, resistance to drugs or to environmental changes very quickly. But we also engage in limited horizontal gene transfer, especially with viruses, which can reverse transcribe into our genomes. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly why we have linear and they've got circular.
Okay. Yeah.
So when I talk about complex life, I really am referring to something which has got these sorts of complex organelles, and also mitochondria. I'll get onto mitochondria in a second because that's really key.
Sure.
Linear chromosomes, which have got homologous pairs. So we've got 23 pairs of chromosomes, but other organisms have got different amounts. Different animals have got different numbers of chromosomes, for example, plants as well. Multicellularity. So many eukaryotes are multicellular. That means that their bodies are composed of many cells, often trillions. So we've got trillions of eukaryotic cells in our bodies, and they are organized into tissues and organ systems which have got specialized functions, muscles, nervous tissue, etc. And so we don't find prokaryotic animals. And why is that? I think it has to do with energy. So that is Nick Lane's idea. Nick Lane is the author of this book, The Vital Question, which everyone should read. Energy, Evolution, and the Origins of Complex Life. And he's also written this other book recently. It just came out this year.
Oh, this is Transformer or something,
Transformer.
right?
I thought I had it here, but it came out this year. Oh, here it is. Sorry. The Deep Chemistry of Life and Death. In this one, he talks about what's called the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. This is an important metabolic circuit in the cell, and it's involved in producing adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cell. Although there's another step after this, which is more important. But the way that this is often taught, the Krebs cycle is often taught in introductory courses, is to just sort of brush over it and say that it's a step on the way to the electron transport chain. But it's actually much more interesting and complex than that. So the Krebs cycle
I'm
is
having
really central to metabolism. Yep.
I'm having flashbacks to my freshman year of high school taking biology. I remember all of these terms. I can't believe you haven't called mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell yet, though.
Oh, I was going to do that.
All right. So sorry to spoil it. I can't wait. I'm waiting with bated breath, Louis.
So this book talks about cancer and how the Krebs cycle can actually run in reverse in certain conditions, like in cancer cells. Certain circuits within the Krebs cycle can actually go in reverse to the normal direction. Although ironically, what we think of as the Krebs cycle, it's actually is itself the reverse of what initially evolved. So like deep in the past when life was first arising, probably in hydrothermal vents, the Krebs cycle or something like it was actually going in the opposite direction to what we usually associate with a Krebs cycle. So he goes into all that sort of stuff in his book. Very, very complex book. I think it does as well as anybody can to sort of make it accessible to a popular audience, although, you'll definitely struggle in parts with this book and the other one, Vital Question.
And what is Nick Lane's background? Who is this guy?
He's a British biochemist and bioenergeticist. So he studies how thermodynamics plays into the question of what is life.
Excellent.
And he's got different experiments going on in his lab. Different people look at different things, including the origins of the genetic code and also metabolism, which he's very interested in. He actually thinks that metabolism came before the genetic code. So
this is, I've heard, and I'm really at the edge of my experience and knowledge here talking about this, but I heard an interview with Bobby Azarian, who was talking very similarly about the role of energetic systems and evolution in the creation of life. And then I also think this is something David Deutsch talks about as well. Super fascinating and compelling.
And I think it's becoming increasingly well appreciated because up till now, people have thought more in terms of self-replicating molecules, the genetic information and how that evolved. And they see that as like the key to life. But in fact, it could have been metabolism, which was the key. And genetics came afterwards. Not that genetics is unimportant, but in terms of the chronology of how life got started on Earth, it could well have been that metabolic systems were the first ones.
And what is metabolism, just in a very basic way?
Metabolism is a whole series of chemical reactions taking place in an organism to produce carbon-based molecules, so-called organic molecules. And it involves combining molecules to make larger ones or breaking them down to extract energy. And there's also energy metabolism, which is the production of adenosine triphosphate or ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. So some of that energy currency is produced by glycolysis. Some is produced by the Krebs cycle, which I just mentioned. I think I have here is the Krebs cycle, sorry. Again, apologies for the dark background. But this is a very complex series of events. Different molecules are being used as intermediates, and then you get products. You do get some adenosine triphosphate from this, But then I'm going to show you another step called the electron transport chain, which is producing most of the ATP in the cell, in the eukaryotic cell, because bacteria do not have mitochondria. So you get this sort of circle. This why it's called a cycle is because you start with acetyl coenzyme A, and then that's going to react with oxaloacetate to produce citrate, and then you're going to get some water and other byproducts along the way, things being combined. And there's also like other circuits within this which are involved in biosynthesis of important biochemicals. But ultimately, the way that this is taught a lot of the time is just to focus on the role that this plays in ATP production. And it sort of ignores how other molecules are being made. And there's sort of a tension at the heart of the Krebs cycle, because you can shunt off some of these products for biosynthesis, but then that eats into the ATP production, or you can prioritize ATP at the expense of biosynthesis. And some of these circuits, this is very simplified, but it's sort of like a roundabout, you know, like when you're driving in a city, you get to a roundabout and there's like different lanes within that. Some of those circuits can actually run in reverse under certain conditions. And we see that in different kinds of bacteria and also in cancer, interestingly.
Oh, interesting.
So that's something that Nick Lane devotes many chapters to in his book.
So this like metabolic cycle or process, it's pretty it's consistent life form to life form.
For the most part,
it's pretty standard.
Yeah, I mean, it's highly conserved, but there are some little differences here and there.
Right. And I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the geothermal vents. I know this is a little bit off the ranch, but
this is a alkaline
lo and behold. Yeah, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and where and how it factors into this whole conversation of life emergence.
Yeah, so this structure here is a hydrothermal vent. It's a specific type of hydrothermal vent. It's an alkaline vent. There's also the black smokers, which have gotten a bit more press because they're more dramatic. And they're also probably important to an extent in the origin of life question. But Nick Lane thinks that these ones are really the important ones.
Is that a crystallization process occurring there, Luis?
It's a serpentinization process. I think it's similar to crystallization. You get these minerals kind of building on each other, and you get these microporous structures, which are really key. Now, so you can see these things are huge. This is called Crystal City or something. They gave the nickname, I think, in the Atlantic Ocean, but you find them deep in the sea.
Cool.
So the reason that these are important is because you get these microporous structures, which are acting as basically protocells in a very rudimentary way, because you get
it looks like coral.
Yeah, it's kind of, I guess it's sort of similar to coral in a way, but the important thing is you get these little cavities which separate the alkaline fluid in the vents from the surrounding seawater, which is more acidic, because water absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and so there's a differential in between the outside and the inside of these little pores, and that facilitates proton extrusion and electron flow. Okay, which is something that we find in our cells, and that's this process provides energy for biosynthesis, and we do find in his experiments in his lab that you can get certain biochemicals, organic molecules forming by having a laminar flow across these pores and having a pH difference as well. You can get the buildup of a surprising number of biomolecules, which are also the intermediates of the Krebs cycle. So you can get very rudimentary Krebs cycle style processes going on, and that's without genetics. That's the important thing as well, that you don't need a genetic code to get this process going.
I brought up Brooke's comment here that there's a snail with an iron shell that lives in volcanoes. Nature is wild, creative, and anti-entropic. Which, when we talk about this, or listening to you talk about this, what is so fascinating to me is that you're describing an environment that, in any sense that we understand, is extremely hostile to life. It's deep underwater. There's no light. There's no oxygen. It's highly basic or alkaline. But we still get these extremely strange creatures that live down at those depths. And then also, as you're talking about, this is, where people theorize that life began.
Yeah.
And I just think that juxtaposition is so fascinating, between these kind of weird deep sea creatures that you find down there, and then also this notion that it is primordial, like it's what may have started it all.
And that's also a good point in terms of thinking about xenobiology, which is specifically alien life. In terms of like, what are the conditions in the universe where you could potentially find life? We're finding life, existing in environments that we had previously thought uninhabitable, and that could, increase the range of environments across the universe where we could look for life.
So we have a question here from Figu. Luis, does science contemplate other possible life forms we haven't seen yet? So, for example, is it possible to have non-carbon based life forms? If so, what would they be made of as an alternative?
An alternative to carbon is silicon, which has got behaves somewhat similarly to carbon, although it's not as versatile. So that's one. But Campbell, I think you talked last time about some research which is being done with plasma, where you could get self-replicating patterns or structures in plasma.
Saitovich, Dr. I think Saitovich, she's from the physics lab in St. Petersburg, Russia, National Academy of Sciences there. He has a published paper in 2007, New Physics Journal, I think it was, and it describes experiments in the lab, and he talks about how plasma structures, the fourth state of matter, ionized aerosols and things like that, structured plasmas fulfill all of the basic definitional criteria for living things. Now it specifies that doesn't mean that the plasma structures are alive. What it means is that the definition is met, and therefore maybe we should change the definition, or maybe we should look at what it means to be alive. But that there are published physics papers that indicate that plasma structures can fulfill the definitional criteria of life.
Yeah, those are the two ones I can think of: silicon-based life and something like what you're talking about, Campbell. I think there are some other ones. I mean, it's probably related also to the question of how life got started, because there's different hypotheses, including the RNA world hypothesis. Potentially, like, there's life out there which uses RNA instead of DNA as its main genetic substrate. There could also be life which potentially there could be plant animals, like photosynthesizing animals, although that's probably not a very efficient way to gather your energy if you're an animal. There are some symbiotic bacteria, algae, which live in some snails, and they do something kind of intermediate with that. They derive some benefits from each other, but there's no full-blown photosynthetic animal that we know of. So that's a potential alien life form as well.
Well, this is something I was sort of thinking about from what you were talking about, Luis, like the chemical, biochemical reactions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent those chemical reactions do occur just purely in nature, and we could say that all of this is purely mechanistic, obviously, but independent of what we would ascribe a living thing. Like, I know that there are organic molecules that are found in comets and stuff like that. Doesn't mean that living things created those molecules, but they exist out there. And just one other little thing is that when I was looking at the definition of life, like what a living thing is in relation to this plasma stuff, trying to figure out what the heck they're talking about, what I found was that the definition of living thing has been changed over and over and over again in relation frequently to microscope technology, because each subsequent technological advancement, it is that no known mechanism of X size could be producing the definitional criteria of life. And then you make a better microscope and then it's smaller again.
It's isn't it like von Leeuwenhoek who found cells for the first time with a microscope? Ooh, that we are like deep in the annals of Leah's high school biology knowledge. But and he called them cells because they were like monks' cells or monks' quarters. Anyway.
Right. Oh yeah, I remember the first one of the first scientists found bacteria and stuff. I remember in his notes, I believe he was a Scottish scientist. He described them as wee beasties everywhere. He's like they're freaking out.
But you mentioned the things on comets and outer space, Campbell, which is important for something called panspermia. This is the idea that life was seeded on Earth, or at least the precursors of life may have been provided by meteorites or comets. And so we do find a lot of these organic molecules out in space, but that doesn't mean that there's anything that life originated there. But it is possible that the sprinkling of life, or the sprinkling of organic material, in other words, hydrocarbons from space, may have contributed to life on Earth developing. Some people also think that life on Earth came from Mars by hitching a ride on a meteorite, and that Mars is like the Genesis site. But that's still a controversial view, obviously. But it is conceivable.
Does that not push the question back again?
It does. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
You'd have to explain how the Martians arose.
There's is someone who has professional and intellectual exposure to these subjects, is the panspermia hypothesis taken seriously in any sense? Is it entertained? Cool.
Nick Lane does not credit it, however, but it is a respectable position.
We have a question from the audience member here, the Earth. Are we alive? Maybe life is an illusion. No, we are all trapped in YouTube samsara right now, engaging in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. But if we get enough subscribers, eventually we'll be freed from this and enter, I don't know, super chat nirvana.
That is a good question. It's something that I have begun to increasingly think about the more I dive into the nature of what it means to be alive. And when you try to nail it down, it does appear to be a little bit slippery. It gets away from you a little bit.
The question of life and what living is a little bit different. So Nick Lane talks about whether it might be better to talk about what is living instead of what is life. So living is a dynamic process which involves disequilibrium with the environment and the dissipation of heat and disorder. And you can think about it in terms of a dynamic thermodynamic process. And then there it's more concrete, because you can talk about that you're converting something with high or low entropy to something with high entropy, and you're buying off your complexity by adding disorder to the environment. So that's a very mechanistic and strict kind of definition. Whereas if you're asking what is life, many things which are supposedly alive, they're not doing many of the things which we often attribute to them. So something doesn't have to be reproducing in order to be alive. Something can, viruses are often not thought of as being alive, but they do reproduce. And so it gets a little bit fuzzy there. And also when we're thinking about the origin of life, like exactly what point can we say that it jumped from being non-life to life? Maybe that's just a useless question anyway.
And that's audience member Brooke asked, didn't someone create DNA just using electricity and water? Like life was a broadest frequency that life will, broadcast frequency that life will appear where it can. Yeah, I've heard that too. But Lewis, like you've said, it's a question if it can even be answered of pinpointing this crossover from um, the DNA components
Yeah.
onto some kind of emergent energetic process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean DNA. I think the viewer was thinking about the Miller-Urey experiments, which were
Hmm.
done in the 50s, and you were basically running gas with different compounds through electricity to simulate lightning, and then you get some biomolecules forming. Although some of the assumptions were wrong, but then they did it under different atmospheric conditions, and you still got some important biomolecules. DNA is a little bit more complex, and there's different hypotheses about how DNA got started. But I think that I favor the metabolism first idea.
Hmm.
First of all, you need some sort of engine of metabolism to even produce something like DNA, like many intermediate steps. And people have often, I think maybe Richard Dawkins, with his selfish gene idea, has had an inordinate influence on biology because he talks about
Hmm.
self-replicating molecules like floating around in the sea, and then it's not really explained how that happened, like how that got started. I think you need something like a hydrothermal vent to get the engine started, and then you can get more complexification.
Hmm.
Anyway, I'm being very simplistic here, but that's basically
But,
kind of the outlines of that.
hmm.
Let me just mention mitochondria, since you did, Leah.
The powerhouse of the cell right here, front and center.
Yep. So these are found in eukaryotic cells. Some eukaryotic cells have got thousands of these, and other ones have got only dozens or a few hundred. Depends on the function of the cell. So you find a lot of these in muscle cells because they need a lot of they need to produce a lot of ATP.
Hmm.
But these are actually they came from bacteria. So what happened was that deep in the past, one of the archaea engulfed a bacteria. So the archaea are another type of prokaryotic cell, and then you've got the other domain of the prokarya called the bacteria. So there was an endosymbiosis where a bacterium was engulfed by an archaeon, and then it eventually evolved into mitochondria. Okay, so these
Hmm.
have got their own DNA, only a relative handful of genes, but what's going on here is that you've got this outer membrane, okay, and this inner membrane, which is very invaginated, it's very convoluted in order to increase the surface area. And there on the surface area of that inner membrane, you've got a series of channel proteins, which are shunting electrons and sending them to, in our case, oxygen molecules, which are the electron acceptors.
Hmm.
And then this is ultimately powering the production of adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cell. So let me just show you what the electron transport chain looks like. And by the way, the citric acid cycle is also taking place in the mitochondria. But the electron transport chain is where most of the ATP is being produced. Bloody hell, here it is. Yeah, so this is the electron transport chain. Okay, so here's the outer membrane of the mitochondria. Here is the inner
Hmm.
membrane that I showed you, the invaginated one. And then you've got this NADH, which is an electron donor. It was formed from the breakdown of glucose or other food molecules. So we get our glucose from eating plant matter or animal matter, and then it gets broken down, and we get some NADH, which is contributing electrons. So the electrons are being shunted across these surface proteins. These are proteins, these blue ones, which are embedded into the inner membrane. Okay, so the electrons are going like that, sent along, and then eventually recombined here with oxygen and hydrogen to produce water. But as they're being shunted along, uh, H plus, which is just free protons, are being extruded through the protein. Okay, so they're coming up. They're not combining with the electron because the electron's just going this way, and but they're going through a separate channel within the protein, and they're accumulating up here. So you're getting this electrical charge difference between this side and this side, and it's actually a very powerful charge difference. And so the only way these can come back down is to go through this other protein, which is the ATP synthase. This is actually a turbine. It actually spins. So as the protons come back down, they spin. It causes this to spin, and then that combines adenosine diphosphate with a free phosphate, and then that forms ATP, right? And so that's really the engine for most of the ATP production in our cells, and that's taking place in the mitochondria. Now, this also gets onto something that Nick Lane details in especially the Vital Question book, which is, why is it that life stayed so simple for so long? Okay, so this is a timeline of the Earth. You've probably seen representation of this before. So this is showing, the origin of the Earth, probably about 4.5-ish billion years ago, and then water. And then Luca is the last universal common ancestor. So that's the ancestor of all life. Probably arose in those hydrothermal vents. And most of the surface of the Earth was covered in water back then. Earliest fossils that we find, and the late heavy bombardment meteorites. Single-celled life, definitely by here, it exists. And then earliest oxygen in the atmosphere. So you get some photosynthesis evolving. So that's using light from the sun in order to produce sugar. And then it's also expelling oxygen as a waste product. But that would later on build up very significantly in the atmosphere. And then you would get aerobic respiration evolving, which uses O2 as the electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Okay, so here you've got O2. The electron wants to go to the O2. That's the most efficient electron acceptor that we know of, but there are other ones which life used before oxygen built up in the atmosphere. And some organisms still use those alternative electron acceptors. So photosynthesis, and then very, very kind of it took like billions of years for eukaryotes to arise, okay? And that was probably because of the union of that archaeon and that bacteria. And then that produced, evolved into mitochondria in our cells, that bacteria. So why did that take so long? Well, probably because it was a very unlikely event, for one thing. The mitochondria in our cells, the endosymbiosis that led to that probably only happened once. So there are actually many endosymbioses between bacteria and prokaryotes, but they do not lead to mitochondria. And so that evolution of mitochondria probably just happened once. And that is what really allowed eukaryotes to become complex, because that gives you more internal energy, okay? Prokaryotes tend to be very limited in size. They tend to be very, very small. And the reason is that they do their electron transport chain on their plasma membrane, on their surface, because they don't have any internal mitochondria. So that places a limit on how big you can get. And if you have them internally, then that allows you to do more things, okay? So the things that eukaryotes do, such as, being multicellular, which also took a long time, by the way. Sexual reproduction probably evolved around there. And many other things that eukaryotes can do that prokaryotes cannot do. So mitochondria are really at the center of that. And it's probably the case that there was an energetic barrier. You have to have mitochondria in order to get much more complex. Because if you think about it, prokaryotes, they're very, very biochemically diverse. So it can't just be because of information. there has to be some sort of extra constraint which limited the evolution of complexity. So that was probably energy availability. Any questions?
I was thinking about, okay, so mitochondria. I know that those are related in some way to inheriting genetics from the maternal line. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and there are a variety of genetic disorders that I'm
Yes.
aware of, especially in small populations and isolated populations. So I know, for example, in Iceland, and in some other populations, they've done these studies based on the genetic diseases being a higher prevalence based on mitochondria. Now, like, do you know why is it that some DNA is contained in mitochondria, and
Yeah.
why are there the two sets? Like, what is going on there? Like you
Yeah.
were saying, yeah.
So the electron transport chain, you've got these proteins which are encoded by genes, because proteins are encoded by genes. And
Okay.
many of those genes are present in the nucleus of the eukaryotic cell. And some of them, a relative handful, are encoded by the mitochondria's own genome. Okay. Now, I think mitochondria, they've only got like 30 or so genes, whereas the eukaryotic, the nuclear DNA has got thousands, okay, over 20,000. So it seems to be, according to Nick Lane, it seems to be the case that you need a minimum amount of genes to stay behind in the mitochondria, because they need to carefully coordinate the actions of the electron transport chain. So you need those sort of,
Okay.
minimum genome just to stay behind to do some critical things which have to be done quickly.
Damn. Okay.
Mitochondrial DNA, I think, is what's used for tracing lineage. I feel
Yeah,
like that's
exactly.
what I've
Yeah,
heard when you hear about how Genghis Khan
yeah,
has millions and millions of offspring, or
yeah. The matrilineal line can be traced back because it's exclusively inherited. It's passed on by in the egg cells, okay, and virtually never by the sperm. So you can trace back the matrilineal line. There's also something you might have heard of called mitochondrial Eve, which
oh yeah,
yeah.
one of our audience members just mentioned mitochondrial Eve.
Mm-hmm. So it does not mean that she was the first woman. It just means that the mitochondrial DNA which exists today can be traced back to her. So yeah, I mean, interesting thing about the fact that some of the mitochondria, some of the genes are still in the mitochondria, is that you can get incompatibilities between the nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. So in the electron transport chain, these proteins have to be pretty much perfectly placed. And even the iron sulfur clusters within them, which are involved in the shunting of the electrons within these proteins, also have to be, within angstroms of distance. They have to be very, very precisely placed. If there is any incompatibility between the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA, you can get, these being suboptimal, and then you don't produce enough ATP. And animals can actually abort their fetuses when they're not good enough. So like when their electron transport chains are not sufficient for their ecological requirements, they can just spontaneously abort the fetus in order to avoid not putting any more resources into that.
So there's some sort of automatic mechanism that can tell the efficiency, essentially. That's so
Yes.
interesting.
I think Little Buddy and Little
Yeah.
Buddy's sister Minnie are
Mini.
yes expressing their enthusiasm for this evening's show. So we got a question from Mitch A here. Cellular material is the hardware or the software?
Cellular material. So I guess
That's like the hardware, and I guess
Yeah.
genetics and DNA would be the software, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Although interestingly, RNA is thought by some scientists to have been the original sort of important molecule because it's got some things it does well, which is similar to protein, and some things similar to DNA, but it's not as good as either one. But we still use RNA as an intermediate, transcribing DNA messages into RNA messages and then translating that into protein. So it's still an intermediate that we use. But yeah, there is that interesting sort of hardware-software distinction. But probably the hardware evolved first.
Okay. And we have this question here from Fig. Is it conceivable that DNA and mitochondria can be manipulated with CRISPR? And what kind of chimeras can conceivably be created?
Yeah, CRISPR is very powerful. So you can actually, let's see. I guess it's in principle, it's possible to increase ATP production in mitochondria using something like CRISPR, but you also have to take into account the interaction between the mitochondrial and the nuclear DNA. So, you probably can't just change one thing because there's a very delicate balance you have to strike.
And we have another super important question here. Where is the dog barking coming from? OMG.
From my house. Sorry.
All right. Got that sorted out.
Yeah, but there are these sorts of, just getting back to something you said, Campbell, like in Iceland or wherever, there are certainly population clusters which experience more diseases which are based on potential incompatibilities between mitochondrial and nuclear DNA. So you can get those sorts of different population frequencies of those diseases. So that's really interesting as well. Let's see where I was up to. So animals are very complex, obviously. They move around a lot. Many animals have got mobile life stages. Some of them have got sessile life stages, like tunicates. They kind of latch onto the sea floor and they stay there as adults. But most animals can move around for most of their life cycle. And this is an animal right here, cephalopod.
Hey, he was on the show last week.
Yeah, well, they're being more... I'm pleased to say that they're being more thought about in science fiction as like the kind of archetype for what aliens might be like. Have you noticed that?
Yes, well, I think, right, and that is, I think, in response to broader recognition of the cognitive and consciousness capabilities of the cephalopods.
Exactly. They're very intelligent, and they've got a high degree of dexterity with their limbs. But the amazing thing is that their nervous systems and the complexity of the nervous systems, at least, are convergently evolved from ours. So they did not come from a common ancestor. I mean, if you go back far enough,
that's
there is
really
a common
fascinating.
Ancestor. But the brains are not from a common ancestor. They're independently derived, as are the eyes. They've actually got better eyes than we do, but they're very, very similar to ours. But that brings us to another consideration, which is convergent evolution, which is the independent evolution of traits in response to similar environmental pressures. Okay, here is Simon Conway Morris, who was a very big advocate of the importance of convergent evolution. Okay, the underlying reason for convergence seems to be that all organisms are under constant scrutiny by natural selection and are also subject to the constraints of the physical and chemical factors that severely limit the action of all inhabitants of the biosphere. Put simply, convergence shows that in a real world, not all things are possible. So he
sounds
actually,
like a pseudo-skeptic debunker to me.
He thinks that he's a serious scientist, by the way, but
yeah,
he makes a big claim, which is that probably extraterrestrial life, intelligent extraterrestrial life. I'll get onto what intelligence means. But here I'm just in the anthropomorphic sense, right? Our type of intelligence. He thinks that they would be humanoid because there are certain environments which select for intelligence and certain things which you need in order to, manipulate your environment or be able to communicate with others, etc. And that places limits on your morphology and things like that. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this speculation by Dale Russell. This is a
Oh yeah.
This is from 1980, and he actually copped a little bit of ridicule for this. But this is basically just his idea of what would have happened if the KT event, which was the end of the Cretaceous period, when the meteorite, struck the Yucatan Peninsula, leading to the extinction of dinosaurs. Although I don't remember if the bolide impact theory was popular yet, but the dinosaurs became extinct except for the birds. But imagine that had not happened. Is it possible that a humanoid dinosaur could have evolved from something like this? So there were some dinosaurs with relatively large brains for their body size. Among the theropods, the meat-eating dinosaurs. And it's, if you think about our own evolution from tree-dwelling organisms, this is not that far-fetched. But the question is really like, does it have to be that humanoid, right? But maybe that's going too far. But I think Simon Conway Morris would probably agree with this speculation. Interestingly, this actually reminds me of something that the Mormons believe. And Conway Morris is actually a religious believer. He draws some theological significance from convergent evolution, but I don't think he's a Mormon. But the Mormons believe that there are people on other planets, and something like this would fit nicely within their theological framework.
Yep, we have audience member here, Fig, commenting that some conspiracy theorists actually believe this happened and that this accounts for those encounters with lizard-like ETs.
Yeah,
right.
The reptilians. There was actually a movie in the 1970s. It was actually a 3-part movie called V, about these reptilians who came to Earth to take over. But I think, like if you think about abduction experiences, they're mostly, or indeed contact experiences, it's either human beings or the Greys or something basically humanoid. And depending on what you think of convergent evolution and its universality, that could be evidence. The frequency of humanoid extraterrestrials in abduction cases can be seen as evidence for or against the veracity of those stories. Okay, so animals they tend to have complex nervous systems. Nervous systems are a type of tissue which gives animals a high degree of responsiveness to the environment, so they can react to things in real time. I talked about convergent evolution there. By the way, here's another example. So these come from North America or South America, and these come from Australia. And these are independently evolved, but they fit very similar ecological niches. So this flying squirrel is very similar to this flying phalanger. This groundhog is similar to the wombat, etc. But these all evolved separately from a common ancestor, which arrived in Australia, and then they diversified in Australia independently of these ones, even though they look superficially similar. So yeah, convergent evolution is certainly very important and very striking, but I would be cautious about drawing too many conclusions when we're talking about extraterrestrial life. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, yeah, I was wondering with this is related. The dinosaurs were conceivably, I mean, wiped out by the asteroid. How long ago was that? Was that 50 million?
65, about 66 million years ago.
66 million years ago. And dinosaurs were around for quite a bit longer than 66 million years, right? Like well,
they were around for the last 5 million or so years of the Cretaceous period.
Okay, so they were only around for about 5 million years before they got wiped out?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. How so when the dinosaurs arose from the prior evolutionary history of whatever it was, 3 point whatever billion years, and then they got wiped out and then the mammals came up, it seemed
Yeah.
like the life, like in terms of intelligence, like humans, we sort of filled a niche that obviously was not really being maximally exploited previously. Now, what sort of ideas do you have about why that is? Why was there not an intelligent thing seemingly filling in that niche prior to that? Was it because of efficiency of energy, like our brains with our warm-bloodedness? Like, well, what's going on there?
Probably a combination of things. One of them is that
Mhm.
nervous systems are very energetically expensive. So we consume about, well, in terms of calories, the nervous system of a human being is about 25% of the calories that we consume,
Wow.
even though the mass is only about 5%. So it's got an outsized consumption of energy. So that could be one thing, that evolution doesn't tend to favor very large or complex nervous systems because the animal's already doing the job pretty well. So there's no need to, complexify that tissue, that organ system much more. So there could be a cost benefit ratio going on, which is not favorable to the evolution of complex or super complex nervous systems. The other thing is that probably you need pre-existing conditions in order to have human level intelligence arise, such as dexterous or semi-dexterous fingers,
Opposable thumbs, right?
yeah, opposable thumbs, and also sociality, so that organisms living in groups, sharing information, teaching each other stuff,
Mhm.
passing on what could be called culture. That's probably another constraint. And so, as far as we know, it's only happened once, maybe twice with Neanderthals, even though there was some interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, apparently. But certainly a very, very rare event. And so, again, even if we find animal life on other planets, we shouldn't expect it to have any human level intelligence as an inevitable outcome of that.
So we have a question from the audience here. How do we explain dinosaurs as a matter of evolution given their massive sizes? In
Yeah.
other words, would you say, Lewis, that dinosaurs may have become smaller over time to better adapt and survive?
Well, some dinosaurs were actually very small. Some were like chicken-sized, or the size of a chihuahua. I was thinking of mini just then. But some dinosaurs obviously were huge, especially the sauropods. Now, they were actually in the Cenozoic era, which followed the KT event. You did get the evolution of massive megafauna in the mammals.
Mhm.
So the dinosaurs were not the only super large animals, but certainly there were very large dinosaurs. It could have been oxygen level in the atmosphere was a bit higher back then, although I think that's been disputed. But having more
Mhm.
oxygen does give you more energy availability, so that could be one thing. There could also have been an arms race going on where size was something favored by selection. So like predator-prey coevolution favored having larger size. That could
Mhm.
have just been a contingent thing. So we could conceivably have that happen again. The largest land animals these days are the African elephants. They're pretty big. They're about the size of a triceratops, but we don't currently have anything the size of a Brachiosaurus, except in the oceans with the whales. So the blue
Right.
whale is actually the largest animal that's ever lived that we know about. and it's still around today.
Even larger than dinosaurs?
Yeah, it is
Oh, wow.
in terms of mass. But it's got, the water, the aqueous environment to keep it buoyant, so you can get very
Right.
large animals.
Yeah,
It's
so it doesn't collapse on itself or anything.
right, which is why when they beach themselves, they crush their own lungs, basically. But yeah, I mean, it's not certain why dinosaurs got so big. I think it was a combination of abiotic factors like atmospheric oxygen, or some sort of plant. Well, I mean, plants were not as diverse as they are now, although the angiosperms did evolve in the Jurassic. So those are the flowering plants, but I don't know if that had much of an effect. But there could have been some food source which allowed dinos to get very big.
It was Vril.
Vril, yeah, Vril.
Yes, it was definitely Vril.
And also the co-evolutionary arms race between predator and prey lineages probably favored large size in many cases. See if there's any other pictures here that I want to show necessarily. Well, so let me talk about intelligence. So this is another form of complexity, because here we're talking about cognitive complexity. And by intelligence, people have come up with different definitions, and some people have denied that you can even have a definition of intelligence. But in the sense that this other author is talking about, and this is also a very good book. This is by Kevin N. Leyland, Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, How Culture Made the Human Mind. In this book, he talks about how culture is not something that simply arose from a large brain, but rather something which was involved in a co-evolutionary cycle, a positive feedback loop with biology. So the larger your brain was, the more culture you could have in the sense that you could share information more readily, you could try out different things, and culture itself favored larger brains, okay? And so it was like an autocatalytic positive feedback loop. So by intelligence, I mean here the strictly anthropomorphic sense of possessing certain attributes in our cognition, such as abstract thought, complex language with syntax and grammar, which allows you to construct endlessly recursive strings of meaning, higher order intentionality, the ability to manipulate tools, to pass on cultural knowledge between peers and down to children, as well as to assimilate those lessons yourself from your conspecifics, and to learn. And in this book, it's an incredible book. He goes into animal studies that have been done, game theory type simulations, similar to the ones in the 1970s, but updated to include learning by the agents in these games, so they can learn
like agent-based modeling.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
And it seems that learning and imitation are incredibly important to the evolution of intelligence. And
yeah, that makes sense, like mimetic intellectual development.
And one cool thing about learning is that you don't have to engage in the dangerous activities which allow the person that learned that to gain that knowledge. You can just copy what they did,
right,
and
like,
eschew the risks.
I follow this neuroscientist and writer Eric Hole, and he just won an essay contest, basically writing about why humans existed so long before we saw the emergence of like human culture as we would understand it in terms of like storytelling, art, music, things like that. And he had this really interesting theory about he was reviewing a book that was talking about this theory, about how it's only when humans were living in environments where their social circles grew substantially before they started to actually develop like meaningful culture beyond just immediate survival considerations. And he basically attributes this to the idea that when you have this broader extended network of social connection, there's not as much squabbling and infighting the way there is in like your immediate social circle. So think about how you get things done in a professional environment. You're not like fighting and arguing and beating each other up because you have less personal involvement.
Yeah.
And he talks basically about this idea that once you had this critical mass of social organization found in like villages or like community, um, and once people's social engagements grew beyond like the immediate family, that's really what started that flywheel of collaborative cultural establishment and creativity.
Yeah, that does resonate a lot with what Leyland also says. I
Mm-hmm.
guess Leyland would emphasize the teaching aspect, which is
Right.
passing on information to your offspring. And that involves the most efficient way of doing that is using language. So, in his view, language evolved specifically to facilitate the passing on of cultural information from parents to offspring in various things like tool use or manufacturing certain items or knowing where food is in the environment. But that could have generalized as well into a general purpose module in the brain, which could not only be good at learning how to build tools, but also learning how to conspire or learning how to form alliances, etc.
We
So there is also some backstabbing and sort of Machiavellian aspects to this as well, but there's also a lot of cooperative aspects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So we have audience comment here saying that I would say meaningful culture happened when Iron Maiden was formed in the 70s in Britain. Before that, it was still the Dark Ages. Yes, truly. The release of Power Slave is what marks our emergence into modernity. Yeah, I mean, I think, I am so fascinated by the historiography and values and behaviors that we project onto our ancestors and predecessors. I think there's this natural inclination, candidly, I think born of excessive romanticization of American rugged individualism, that
Mhm.
existing in prehistoric times was extremely adversarial and violent and terrible. But there is, it seems to me that there's consistent evidence that it was highly collaborative, that people behaved very similarly to how they behave now with like their immediate cohort in terms of caretaking.
Yeah.
I can distinctly remember reading about like an archaeological dig that unearthed a prehistoric person who'd had a broken leg and healed, and that
Yeah.
was basically taken as an oblique indicator that humans were caring for their sick and for their ailing instead of just leaving them to die. um,
Mhm.
and I think I just think that speaks. I mean, maybe I'm feeling romantic on Thanksgiving Eve, but that speaks to sort of a pervasive sense of cooperation and collaboration that I think humans have exhibited for a very, very long time.
Yes, and actually that reminds me of another book by David Sloan Wilson, who
Mm-hmm.
is he's actually investigated the evolution of religion, but
Okay.
he's written a recent book about how we can use Darwinian lessons in shaping society to be more humane and cooperative. And he does
Mm-hmm.
talk about group selection as a important driver in human evolution, because if you think about it, throughout most of our history as humans, we've been living in small hunter-gatherer groups of no more than a few dozen individuals, and your fate is really tied to the group. So if
Yes.
help your group, even go out of your way to help it, risk your own life, for example, then the group as a whole can benefit. And so he thinks that group selection was important. Probably is important for any species with a significant amount of culture, especially because the information is going to accumulate and be shared. So one of the important things about culture is that it's acting as a reservoir of experience. So
Mm-hmm.
you can tap into those lessons and that information to do things yourself, and then potentially you can build upon that. And information technology these days, we can see that very clearly, but it was always important.
And well, and the origin, if I'm not mistaken, of even the word meme, it originates in gene, right? Like it's these things that self-replicate. Some
Yeah.
remain that have a lasting power. Others go away on the wayside through this self-selection process. So there's this interesting process where it's almost like I'm getting the sense that language and communication and things like that are acting in a secondary capacity, very similarly to DNA itself, in the sense that we are able to, through our conscious intellects, almost be choosing the material that gets propagated, whereas the DNA, it produces automatic reflexive responses in the animals. So it, is it basically like it's an extra layer on top of the DNA that is
Mhm.
adding to that ability to sort of have just the best things stick with us? Is that sort of what the idea is?
Yeah. So memes were first mentioned by, I think, came from a French word actually, but Richard Dawkins is the one who at least popularized the word in his book The Selfish Gene,
Mm-hmm.
which came out in 1976, I think. Um, and the meme idea is, yeah, saying that there's this self-replicating um, unit of information which is analogous to DNA, but it exists as information. So in concrete terms, I guess that would be patterns in the brain encoding certain meanings or whatever sentences or stories. And some of those bits of information are better at propagating themselves because of their effects on the host. And the interesting thing, the memetics is not really taken that seriously, I should say, by most anthropologists and evolutionary biologists.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly Dawkins went too far, but there is a sense in which certain ideas are more virile than others, okay, by virtue of the effects that they have on their hosts, so the brains in
Mm-hmm.
which they reside. And there's also a sense in which some ideas are pathogenic instead of helpful. So think about like how, I don't know, suicide bombers or religious fundamentalists who believe that you should exterminate members of other religions. These are
Mm-hmm.
toxic and pathogenic memes which can spread, and they can actually co-opt certain structures in the brain, let's say, which evolved for other things, but then they can go bad. Um, that's very simplistically put, but I think you sort of know what I mean.
Yeah, well,
Mm-hmm.
and that's very interesting because that's a lot like the behaviors are similar. I'm thinking to the underlying things with genes where like something that can be under some circumstances helpful can
Yeah, yeah,
under other circumstances be harmful. So like
yeah.
in the small group situation that you're describing, I mean I can immediately imagine many different instances where a hunter gatherer taking on a, in quotes, suicide bomber psychology could end up saving his little group.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very interesting that they can
Mhm.
kind of maybe misfire in some ways at times, just like normal like genes underlying that, right?
Exactly.
Hmm.
You can also have selection at different levels of biological organization um, happening across purposes. So what's good for the group
Okay.
may not be good for certain individuals within the group and vice versa. But sometimes they can be aligned. Sometimes your fate really is tied to the good of the group, in
Mm-hmm.
which case group selection could come into play.
Right.
So um, now I mentioned tool use, okay, which has often been touted as the factor favoring the coevolutionary process leading to intelligence. But according to Leyland, it's actually the teaching of tool use and other skills, which was the critical selective environment. And language came out of that because it's such an efficient way of conveying information and meaning to
Right.
a student. Um, now, does intelligence make technological society inevitable? So this also ties into the Fermi paradox and thinking about extraterrestrials, because just because there are potentially intelligent beings out there doesn't mean that they will ever develop what we would consider technological society. Okay, there could be certain constraints on that. First of all, just bad luck. A contingent event in the environment, like a meteorite or a volcano, could wipe out the entire population of organisms. So, human beings once faced a very tight genetic bottleneck where there were only about 20,000 humans on Earth. And that they could easily have gone extinct right there. So that's
Incredible.
one thing. If we think about, permanent human settlements like city-states and industrial societies, there's a requisite there for prior domestication of animals and agriculture. So certain animals are just not suitable for agriculture, which is maybe why the Australian Aborigines never developed, settled into permanent settlements. They've, for tens of thousands of years, up till when Europeans discovered Australia, they were just living as hunter-gatherers. And it could just be because the animals there were not suitable for domestication. And just culture. So certain cultures just can develop where staying put is just not viewed as a good thing. It could be religious reasons or other reasons. If you think about the amount of coercion that's taken place in human societal evolution, so large settler populations could accumulate whatever food, or they could build up armies because they've got more division of labor. Then they can force other groups to,
Right.
do their bidding, or they would exterminate them and stuff.
Yeah, it's like almost like economies of scale. Around human survival. So we have a question from friend of the show, Simon Fly. How big a factor is environment to the development of complex life?
The environment is extremely, it's really central, whether you're thinking of biotic or abiotic factors. So let's see. If we're thinking about abiotic factors, that would be things like temperature, acidity, availability of water. And organisms have got countless adaptations, tailored to dealing with different abiotic conditions. If you think about, like, when you go out into the desert, there are some plants which have evolved to retain moisture. Whereas if you go into a jungle, they're going to have different adaptations because the the availability of water is so much greater there. But then there's also the biotic environment, which is how do you interact with other living things? And there we're dealing with parasites, predators, prey, right? The endosymbionts, which live inside of us, we've evolved and they've evolved.
Well, man, I don't have any parasites or anything living in me. It's just me.
I'm talking about beneficial bacteria.
Right. Yeah, like gut flora and stuff.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's really difficult to sometimes separate the two because the other partner is itself evolving to the abiotic factors as well. But yeah, they're both extremely important. And then often you get like a very important event, like a seminal event, which changes everything. For example, the Great Oxidation Event, which happened very, long time ago, billions of years ago, when a lot of oxygen became available in the atmosphere. That that opened the way for aerobic respiration to evolve. That's when you use O2 as the electron transport, the electron acceptor. And then that set off other things. So you have these kind of revolutionary events which change the nature of the game as well.
And do we know why that event occurred? The oxygenation event or whatever it's called?
Yeah, the oxidation event, because photosynthesis.
So it was plant. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't plants per se. It was cyanobacteria. But they by the way, cyanobacteria are I mentioned the mitochondria are derived from free-living bacteria, which entered into an endosymbiosis with a archaeal cell. It turns out that chloroplasts, which live in plants, those are the sites of photosynthesis in plants. They themselves came from cyanobacteria. So that was another endosymbiosis. But the release of oxygen from photosynthesis, okay, so that took a long time to build up in the atmosphere. But once it did, some organisms had to adapt to that because oxygen is often, it was poisonous to life back then. And so you had to either hide from the oxygen or you had to adapt to it. And many organisms did adapt and they found ways of exploiting it. I've actually got a graph here actually of the oxidation. Where is it?
Is it oxygenation? Yeah, there you go. Cool.
Interesting.
Damn it. Look.
Foiled again.
But this is showing like the level of using geochemical signatures. This is the time in billions of years. So this is 3 billion years ago. The red is the upper limit and the green is the lower estimate. So this is the increase in oxygen in the atmosphere. Okay. And have you guys heard of the Cambrian explosion?
No.
So the Cambrian explosion took place kind of around here, I guess. So that was the evolution of most of the phyla or body plans in the animal kingdom. This took place about 538 million years ago. And that's when you got this great diversification in animal life. Nobody knows why that happened. It's called an explosion because it happened relatively short period of a few million years, maybe, well, nobody knows, but maybe 13 million years, although some estimates push it out to 25 million. So against the backdrop of Earth's history, that's a very short time. But most of the phyla arose during that period. And there could have been different environmental factors like an increase in oxygen, or ironically anoxia, which is the opposite, because then that would force some animals to seek out different environments, especially mobile organisms. It could have been coevolutionary arms races between predator and prey. So this is when eyes evolved, and that's a very useful thing to have to escape predators or to find prey. And then you also get the evolution of like hard parts and weapons and stuff like that. But nobody knows. It was probably a confluence of factors. And again, that also shows the contingency of life, because probably you would need different factors coming together at the right time and in the right amounts to produce something. So it's not just like an inevitable unfolding of complexity. If you were to run the tape again, it might have a very different outcome.
Yeah, we have audience member here, The Earth, which is a perfect username for the subject of our discussion tonight, mentioning that there was a similar event, the Ediacaran explosion, which was not as successful.
The Ediacaran fauna preceded the Cambrian fauna, and there wasn't as much diversification back then, but there seems to have been a sort of a mini explosion back then as well. Not as exuberant as the Cambrian, though. So yeah.
Oh, I was going to say we have another question from Simon, asking if there was a big environmental change after the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Yeah, there was so something like 60% of all the species on Earth died. There was the extinction, not just of the dinosaurs, but other groups like certain marine reptiles, like the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs, and also the pterosaurs, which were the flying reptiles. Some animals, some groups made it through, like the crocodilians, which actually are older than the dinosaurs. Let's see, the angiosperms became more diverse, or at least they continued from the Jurassic. And stuff like that. So you got the extinction of some groups and the the diversification or at least survival of others. I forget exactly what the abiotic changes were in the environment. I think there were more ice ages which took place in the Cenozoic, so after the extinction.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, right after the meteorite impact, you would have gotten a shutdown in photosynthesis across much of the world because of the debris kicked up by the impact, and so
Right.
that shut down a lot of plants, and then that led to the collapse of ecosystems. But some animals were able to survive that, and some plants obviously as well. I'd have to look at the exact the other changes which took place though.
When in the discussions around complexity science and complex systems, they'll term these kinds of events bifurcations, and that these are bifurcation events in the sense that they effectively shift the paradigm of whatever is going on at a particular point in time. And that's what I keep thinking of as you describe these, explosions throughout
Yeah,
history.
and punctuations. So mass
Mm-hmm.
extinction events wipe out a lot of the diversity in
Right.
the biosphere, but then they ironically open the way for diversity to flourish again because the ecological niches are left empty without competition, and so the surviving lineages can then diversify to fill up those niches. So
Mm-hmm.
often when you get mass extinctions, you also get the rapid filling in of those vacant niches afterwards.
Right. Yeah, almost like a power vacuum.
Yeah.
So we'll be wrapping the stream up in a few minutes at the top of the hour. So anyone tuning in, feel free to post your questions, and I'll get them surfaced up for Luis to address. So Luis, what are there? How do I phrase this? How have in your throughout your education and work, how have the theories around complex life changed or adjusted?
I think that they've moved away from gene-centric views to a more kind of systems type biology. So seeing
Mm-hmm.
the interactions of many parts and then seeing that as a whole. So kind of a more holistic view of life.
It reminds me, I've heard a lot more discussion around epigenetics.
And epigenetics, yeah. So non,
And it seems like
yeah,
that's come into more of the forefront of the conversation as well.
exactly. And that also it ties into what Leyland was talking about in his book, Darwin's Unfinished Business
Mm-hmm.
Symphony, which is that there's different kinds of inheritance. So there's obviously genetic inheritance, but then there's also epigenetic effects and also culture. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, seeing more of the diversity of different kinds of inheritance is certainly another one. Um, then there's also the hierarchical selection view favored by Stephen Jay Gould, and
Mm-hmm.
who wrote this book. I read this book. I finished reading it like 2 years ago. It took me a year to read this because it's over 1,000 pages of text.
Oh my.
Yeah, this was his last book before he died in
He's
2002.
he's a real one too. Stephen Jay Gould is great.
Oh yeah, I love him.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this book is great because it goes into an expanded view of Darwinism away
Mm-hmm.
from just the individual level to multiple levels. And he also talks about constraints in both the positive and the negative sense, that there could be channels of change along which evolution is sort of biased, and
Mm-hmm.
that and stuff like that. So it's a really, really rich book. But that's another one. So Niles Eldredge was actually the guy who came up with the idea of punctuated equilibria, even though Stephen Jay Gould popularized and developed it further with Eldredge. But
Mm-hmm.
Eldredge is still around. He makes a big focuses a lot on the idea that there could be different levels of selection, and from the group, from the individual, or actually from the gene to the individual to the group to the species and even higher taxonomic categories. And then also that there are certain patterns which are non-reducible. So, you can think of a species as being an individual in its own right, and the persistence of that individual is not dependent on what any one of its individual constituents does.
Right.
So it's like a higher level kind of reality or ontology to the components.
That's a really interesting point. It makes me think of something I was reading about with slime molds, where you can make a topographical map and put slime molds down, and they naturally replicate on the topography and spread out along essentially the exact same channels that humans have on the Earth's topography. And so if you
There's a
look
lot
at
of metaphor there.
well, if you look, yeah, exactly, yeah, like we're slime or whatever. Well, and that's the thing. It's like if you look from, I keep hitting my mic, from an abstract perspective, and you see these cities and roads and stuff, and then you look at the slime mold, and it's exactly the same. It really starts to make me wonder, what are we as individuals, and if we're looking through a microscope at the Earth and we see a tiny sliver on the side of a rock with a scum layer on it, is it really we think we're individuals, but are we really?
Right,
Like
right.
what's going on there?
Yeah, I'm so fascinated on the intersection again with complexity and complex systems, particularly like agent-based systems where there's no hierarchical rule structure, but rather behaviors are informed on like the node to node relationships rather than an overarching type of rules to drive particular engagements. And Campbell, to your point, like whether we're talking, this is what for me is so fascinating is we see these repetition of patterns on so many different scales through these sort of distributed systems, whether it's a biological system like a body or a cell or a collection of humans or other animals, or how cities and communities evolve and grow, or how slime mold does. Like these are sort of repetitions that exist at all different levels of existence and within, I think, the biological hierarchies that consistently demonstrate very similar behaviors around self-organization. It's super fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. I really like the idea of emergent properties. That there could be properties of systems which are not present at lower levels. And, obviously all these claims are contested and they're controversial, but I think we are going into a new paradigm of biology, which moves away from obviously Darwinian evolution is very important, but we have to expand it and think about different levels of interaction and organization as well. What's the other thing? There's another aspect of biology which has come to the fore in recent years. Oh, the thinking about endosymbiosis. So Lynn Margulies went too far with this. She thought that all of the structures in the eukaryotic cell derived from free-living bacteria. That's probably not the case, but certainly the mitochondria and the chloroplasts did. And, obviously there's that, which I've talked about today, but there's also the important role that bacteria play in us, and also just how symbiosis is so important for really all of life.
Yeah, I've read before that it's like of all the individual cells in your body, it's like there are more cells that are not your DNA than are your DNA inside you. That's so crazy to me.
I don't like that. Gives me weird feelings.
Yeah, it's like, are we living
like
for
thinking about
ourselves?
that?
Yeah, it's like
it's like it's sort of like a ship of Theseus situation where at what point do you stop being you and start just being these other DNAs?
Exactly. Yeah.
Have you guys watched this movie called The Color Out of Space?
No.
It's actually based on a Lovecraft
That's an
story.
old sci-fi movie, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Oh no, well this one's got Nicolas Cage in it. I think there have
Oh, so
been
never mind.
remakes.
It's not that old.
But I don't know if there was a previous version, but this is a relatively new one. But in that movie, there was a very interesting kind of philosophical point, which is that the individual it wants to maintain its integrity, right? Its separation from the environment, and we sort of regard anything that invades us or is like continuous with us with a sense of horror.
Oh,
And
this
in
is
this
like
movie,
Cronenberg. Like the body horror of David Cronenberg draws a lot of that.
Yeah, Videodrome, yeah.
But in that movie, there's a glimpse or a vision of the alien planet where it's basically just like a roiling mass of worm-like creatures, and they're kind of all inside of each other, and they don't really have a sense of individuality or privacy. And I just wonder, like, whether that could be a viable type of alien life, or whether the individual will always try to maintain its own, dignity, so to speak.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Campbell, any final questions for Luis?
I don't think so. That's been extremely interesting. I've really appreciated this conversation. Thank you so much for giving us that presentation, Luis.
Yeah, this was super cool. Really nice to get into something in depth on which you possess subject matter expertise, and also to just give us more exposure to different topics and ideas. Also really cool to see audience chiming in with questions and having this opportunity for like interaction. It's great.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Thanks.
So we'll get things wrapped up for the evening here. We'll be back next week, Wednesday, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. As it stands right now, it's a TBD. Not totally sure what we're going to talk about. We don't have a guest scheduled, but thereafter we'll be hosting Erica Lukes on December 7th.
Sentes.
Oh, yeah, Brian Sentes. Is he coming next week?
Next week, yeah.
Oh,
Excellent.
Fantastic. Oh my God, I'm delighted. Never mind, Brian Sentes next week. I can't wait. So we'll be talking to him. If you are unfamiliar with Brian Sentes, I highly recommend checking out his interviews with Luis on Luis's channel. Seriously great stuff. Guys.
And also his blog.
And also his blog. What's it called?
Skunkworks.
Skunkworks. Yeah, the Skunkworks blog. It's a deeply interdisciplinary intellectual who I think has some truly brilliant things to say about ufology as both like a cultural and social phenomena. And he's coming on, honestly, because I've listened to those interviews so many times that Luis has done with them that I'm excited at the prospect of talking to him. Again, everyone have a great Thanksgiving. We will regroup next Wednesday, same time, same place. And otherwise, hang in there. We can't wait to see you again.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.